والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الخلق أجمعين سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. يا غريب يا مظلوم كربلاء، يا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم إن في ذلك لآيات للعالمين. God states in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and among God's signs are the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the variation in your tongues and colors. Truly in that are signs for those who know. Amanna billah, sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. Let us enliven our hearts and our minds and our gathering with the remembrance of the Holy Prophet and his purified progeny. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Racism is one of the most destructive forces in society today. We've all experienced and witnessed and seen racism on display around us. Most recently, a couple of months ago, in the prominent but not exclusive example of the strangling and killing of George Floyd by a police officer. We all watched in horror as he was killed at the hands of the police officers. And since the murder of George Floyd, in the days and the weeks after, we all experienced and perhaps even participated in sharing sentiments, our condemnations, either through social media posts or through talks and lectures or through protests on the street condemning the blatant racism and the bigotry on display. And we found that in the days and the weeks after this tragic event, that many Muslims, they discussed the horror of racism from an Islamic perspective. There were many talks that discussed racism and Islam, or gave an Islamic perspective to how we can think about racism. And many of these talks, many of these lectures, these workshops, they often tended to focus on and to repeat those major Quranic and prophetic pronouncements that condemn racism, condemn bigotry. Now, in my humble opinion, when speaking of racism from an Islamic point of view, I think that people generally, not always, but generally, in most cases, they don't need to be reminded about what the Quran or the Prophet or the Ahlul Bayt say about racism. That Islam and the Quran and the teachings of Islam, they prohibit and they oppose racism and bigotry. Because most of us have probably memorized the verses of the Quran that talk about this. We've memorized the hadiths of the Prophet that discuss issues related to differences of races and ethnicities and so on and so forth. We've all memorized this. So what's important, in my opinion, is that we move beyond the theoretical and the intellectual and the abstract to the practical. What are the specific actions that must be taken by us as individuals and as communities in order to eradicate racism from our communities and from our midst? What should we do, practically do? Now, in order to answer this question, which we'll try to do briefly tonight in the time that we have together, first we have to understand what racism is. Racism is one expression of a larger phenomenon of bigotry. And there are various types of bigotry. For example, one type of bigotry is extreme nationalism. When you consider yourself as a member of a nation or your nation or the nation that you belong to be superior to other nations. Extreme nationalism is a form of bigotry. Or ethnocentrism, where you consider your ethnicity, your background, to be superior to other ethnicities. And there are many other forms of bigotry. Racism is one of these forms of bigotry. It is when one considers one racial group to be superior to another racial group, or a particular racial group to be inferior to other racial groups. This is the first point that we have to keep in mind. Second is that there are various types of racism itself. There is racism that is based on ethnicity and color. There is racism that is based on biology. There is racism that is based on the body. There is racism that is based on culture. There is racism that is based on gender, on space, and so on and so forth. So there are various kinds and various types and various expressions of racism. And most importantly, in the words of Dr. Ibram Kendi, who is the author of an important book by the name of How to Be an Anti-Racist. For those who are interested, this is a good book. It was actually a bestseller last year. I believe it was written in 2019, last year, where he spells out these various issues related to racism. It's a good book. If you're interested, I highly recommend you read this book. In his words, he gives us an important definition and understanding of racism. He says that racism is not just a set of ideas that we have, but that racism is the marriage of ideas and policies, laws, measures, that produce racial inequity when one racial group has favor or advantage over another. So racism is the marriage of ideas and of policies that lead to and that promote and sustain racial inequities. And he gives many examples of this. One example of racism in this form, under this definition, is sort of the economic ideas and policies that are in place. We find that in communities, for example, if we take the United States of America as an example, that in communities across this country and across this nation, there are certain policies that are enacted by local, by regional, by state, by the federal government that favor one group over another. This is usually what is termed systemic or structural racism. That it's not just ideas. There are particular policies that certain districts, certain neighborhoods, they receive more funding than other neighborhoods. And so their public schools are able to afford more supplies and to hire teachers and so on and so forth. So the educational level of that community is better. And as a result, the students that are coming out of that district or neighborhood, they have a better chance of going to better schools and then getting better jobs and so on and so forth. Whereas poorer neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are not allocated those same funds or less funds, they are at a disadvantage. And so the members of that community, they have a more difficult time competing with those who have greater resources. This is not just a matter of ideas, racial ideas or racist ideas, but also certain policies that promote racial inequity. And one of the things that Dr. Kendi mentions, and it's an important point for us to think about, brothers and sisters, is that the consistent function of racist ideas and other forms of bigotry is that it manipulates you and me to think of people as problems, not of policies as problems. So we think that the problem is with people who have a certain skin color, with people who come from a certain background or culture, with people who speak a particular language. We are manipulated to think that those people are the problems, and we don't think about the policies that promote racial inequity. And so we begin to bicker about these ideas without considering the significance of the policies that come along with these ideas. But there's good news. The good news is that the ideas that we have and the policies that we have, they are not permanent. Being a racist, for instance, is not a permanent tattoo that is placed on you. There is a possibility that one can change his or her ideas, and that policies can also be changed. And thus, brothers and sisters, what is important for us to consider is how important it is for us to both educate ourselves and our communities and also work towards enactment of policy changes. How do we do this? We begin first and foremost with ourselves, with our families, with our acquaintances and friends. Brothers and sisters, we are responsible not just for ourselves, but for the safety and well-being of others around us. The Quran tells us very clearly, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا. O you who believe, O believers, protect yourselves and your families from punishment. We're responsible not just for our individual selves, but for our families, our spouses, our children, our parents, our siblings, our friends, our family members, those around us. And so we have to begin with ourselves. We have to begin with our families and our friends. We have to be able to educate ourselves and others around us about the destructive nature of racism and the racist policies around us, brothers and sisters. And that we have to ensure that we do not participate in this. Because when we participate in this, then we are promoting racial inequity. We are promoting racism. We are giving it new life. We are breathing into it constant life. And so we cannot participate in this. And we have to be especially careful. Now, most of us, if we were to ask one another, are you a racist? Most of us will probably say no. We're not racist, right? But we have to be very careful, not just about manifest racism, that which is clear, calling people names, or, God forbid, hurting others who look different than us, or considering ourselves expressly promoting that we are better than others. These are manifest forms of racism. We have to be especially careful of the latent, the subconscious, the subtle forms of racism in our midst, brothers and sisters, in our minds and in our families, in our gatherings. I'll give you a few examples. Sometimes this subtle racism can be in the form of quote-unquote jokes. We're sitting with friends, family members, and as a joke, we generalize about black people, or about Mexicans, or about Asians, right? For instance, we're sitting in the car, we're driving on the road, right? And someone in front of us is driving slow, or maybe they cut us off, and we pass by and we look at this person, and the person appears to be from a particular ethnicity or race, and suddenly we generalize, we make a comment in the car, oh, all Asians, for instance, they don't know how to drive. They're bad drivers. Now, we might say it innocently, we might say it even jokingly, but these are subtle forms of racism, brothers and sisters. When we generalize in our gatherings, in our discussions, for example, if we are speaking to one another, perhaps about where to reside, where to live, you ask your friend or someone, you tell them, you know, I'm moving to this city, right? Or I'm newly come to this city to move. Where do you recommend that I live? What area do you recommend that I live? Do you recommend I live in area A, for instance? And that person might say, oh, that area? No, that's a bad neighborhood. Black people live there. Mexicans live there, for instance. These generalizations, they promote racism, brothers and sisters. Even if my intention is a good intention, I want my friend to live in a good neighborhood, to live in a safe neighborhood, but the way that we go about discussing these issues, these are subtle forms of racism. These are subconscious forms of racism, racist ideas that we have going around. These people are Arabs. These people are Ajam, for instance. These are all subtle forms of racism that we have and that come up in our midst, in our families, in our gatherings, in private, in public. These occur. And so we have to be very strict, brothers and sisters, as family members, especially as those who are in charge in the family, as parents, as elders. We have to enforce a strict zero tolerance policy when it comes to racist ideas, brothers and sisters. In the same way that as a parent, I would not tolerate at all that, God forbid, my son or daughter would bring alcohol to the house. I would not tolerate this at all, right? In the same way, I have to have zero tolerance for racist ideas and discussions in our midst, in the family, in the house, amongst our friends. Zero tolerance should be unacceptable. This is very important, brothers and sisters. And it is through these steps that we are able to slowly work towards ending racism and racist ideas. And we have to think, you know, when we say policy, right, these are racist ideas. When we say policy, usually the first thing that comes to mind is laws. Laws of the city or the state or the country, the nation, and so on and so forth. This is the first thing that comes to mind. But policies can also be informal laws, informal measures. All of us in our families, in our immediate families, in our nuclear families, we have certain policies. We have certain rules and regulations, things that we abide by. Either they are explicitly known or implicitly. We know that there are certain things that we abide by. we have to think about what kind of policies do we have in our own homes and amongst our own families and friends that promote racial inequity. I'll give you an example, and this is a controversial example. It might get me in trouble, but we have to talk about these things. Take the case of marriage, brothers and sisters. The case of marriage. This is very important. Do we have an implicit or explicit policy in the home that the members of this family may or may not marry someone outside of their ethnicity or outside of their race? We have to ask ourselves this question. Maybe it's not explicit, but is it implied? Is it implicit within us that I would not allow my son or daughter to marry someone just because they are from a different race, or just because they are from a different ethnicity, or they speak a different language? This could be a policy. This could be a measure. It doesn't have to be written in stone, but it could be implied in the way that we interact. Why do I bring up the case of marriage? Because it's an important case, brothers and sisters. As followers of the Ahlul Bayt, it is even more important for us to think about these things. Take the example of our own imams, our own role models, our leaders. Many of the imams, they had interracial marriages. The imams, originally, their ethnicity is that they were Arab from the Hijaz, from the Arabian Peninsula. But many of them, they married with other ethnicities and other races. Take the example of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, who we commemorate. Imam Hussein, do we not every year we come together for 10 days and we lament and we cry and we commemorate? We have to also learn from the life and the legacy of Imam Hussein. These teachings, the way that they conducted themselves, there are great lessons in this, brothers and sisters. Imam Hussein, he married a Persian woman popularly known as Shahrbanu. Shahrbanu is also the mother of the fourth Imam, Al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin. Al-Imam Zayn al-Abidin is thus half Hijazi, half Arab, and half Persian. Right? When you have a husband and a wife, when they marry the child, when we talk about the child's race or ethnicity, in this case, they would be what? He would be half Arab and half Persian. Is this not the case? This is the case. It's simple math. In fact, all of the imams, brothers and sisters, listen to this clearly. All of the imams, from the fourth imam onwards, all of them were mixed race individuals. All of them. Because beginning from the fourth imam, who was mixed race himself, following every single imam was mixed race. Take the example of Al-Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam, our ninth imam. Al-Imam al-Jawad's mother, the wife of the eighth imam, Al-Imam Ali al-Rida alayhi salam, the traditions, they tell us, her name was Khayzaran. She was a Nubian. A Nubian means what? Means that she was from northeast Africa. The Nubian kingdom or the Nubian empire was an ancient civilization in the region of northeast Africa. This is the mother of the ninth Imam, Al-Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam. And there are many other examples. I'm just giving you a few examples just to think about this. So we have to think about this, especially as followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. What kind of policies and ideas do we have within ourselves and within our families and within our circles of friends? And do these policies, do they lead to racial inequity or not? And who do we associate with? We ask ourselves, who do I associate with? Who is my circle of friends? Do I only become friends with people who speak my same language, who come from my city, from my country, from my village? Or am I open to having friendships and acquaintances with people of different backgrounds, of different races, of different ethnicities? We have to ask ourselves this question. It begins with ourselves, brothers and sisters. And this is painful, this is difficult, it's not easy. And it requires persistent self-awareness and self-examination and self-criticism. So it begins first and foremost from our individual selves and our families and our friends. The second stage is it moves on to our institutions. And I mean institutions in sort of a broad fashion, broadly speaking. Our religious centers, our Islamic centers, our mosques, our businesses, other organizations, for-profit or non-profit that we are associated with. What kind of policies, either explicit or implicit, do we base our institutions on? And what can we do in order to make our institutions not racist in their ideas and in their policies? Number one, the important thing to think about is diversity when it comes to leadership and governance, brothers and sisters. Now, I'm not pointing the finger at a particular center or organization. I'm speaking generally. I'm speaking generally for us here who are present, and we have many people who are viewing online. This is a general advice, and I remind, of course, first and foremost myself and those who I associate with before others, that when it comes to our organizations, do we practice diversity of governance and leadership? And this could be racial diversity, it could be ethnic diversity, it could be gender diversity. Some organizations, for instance, they do not allow, either explicitly or implicitly within their governance, within their leadership, they do not allow the participation of women, for instance, as an example. Or they do not allow the participation of people from a particular ethnic or racial background, or they only allow participation from a particular ethnic or racial background. Again, this could be explicit or it could be implicit. So number one is diversity when it comes to our leadership and governance. Number two is that we go beyond simply tolerating diversity in our communities, in our mosques, in our religious centers, towards actively promoting and welcoming others. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum. That we promote, we actively promote, we welcome diversity. And this could be in our promotional materials, this can be in the people we invite, for instance, in an Islamic center or religious center, the people we invite to speak, to participate, to contribute, that we actively find diversity and we bring diversity to the table so that others are contributing, so that we have a range of voices that are contributing. And this also includes other kinds of diversity, brothers and sisters. If you remember, I said that bigotry can appear in many forms. Sometimes the bigotry is towards a particular race or ethnicity or culture. Sometimes it's towards biology or the body. And this is why sometimes we find ourselves having bigoted ideas or policies towards, for instance, the physically disabled. We have a general idea that those who are physically able, those who are able-bodied, they are superior to those who are physically disabled, right? This is a general idea, unfortunately, that some people have. But that's not just it. Sometimes even our policies, and this is why it's important that we also make our centers, our Islamic centers, our religious centers, our non-profit organizations, our businesses, whatever organizations that we are working with and associated with, that they are accessible to those who have special needs, those who are physically disabled. They are accessible to all. So sometimes participants will come and they have problems with vision or hearing or mobility. We have to ensure that our programs, our institutions, our events are accessible to those with special needs, those with physical disabilities. These are important points to consider, brothers and sisters. And then finally, when it comes to our organizations, that we try our best to participate in social justice work, that we collaborate with others around us, other groups and organizations that are dedicated to promoting racial and ethnic equity, to promoting goodness in society, that we collaborate with them, we work with them hand in hand so that we can support these greater objectives. This helps us. This gives our family members, our friends, our community members a chance to engage in social justice work collaboratively with others around us. Brothers and sisters, it's only when we individually and collectively educate ourselves and others about these ideas and these policies that we can actively work towards eradicating and eliminating racism and other forms of bigotry from our midst and from our communities. We have to actively work towards this. It cannot remain just a theoretical subject or an intellectual or an abstract subject. There has to be action. And we have many opportunities for action. And we start, of course, with the appreciation of both our unity in humanity from an Islamic perspective, that we are all human beings, we are all the creation of God, we are all the children of Adam and Eve alayhim as-salam, but also to appreciate our God-given diversity. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ. God says this is a sign of God, that we are diverse in our backgrounds, in our colors, in our languages, in our cultures, in our tastes, in our thinking, in the way that we live, the way that we conduct ourselves. This diversity is God-given. It's a sign of God's existence and God's mercy upon us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, this sign is there for those who reflect, for those who know, those who can appreciate both that unity and diversity. And just take the case of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Take the case of the unity of the stand and objective and the contributions of the companions of Imam Hussein alayhim as-salam, despite their diversity. Imam Hussein had less than 100 followers with him. But if you look at the profile, the demographics of those who joined Imam Hussein, those who stood with him on the day of Ashura and in battle, you find there are men and there are women. You find the one who is old, very old, and the one who is an infant, who is a child. You find the one who is Arab and the one who is a non-Arab. You find the one who is free and the one who is a slave. You find the one who was born a Muslim and the one who converted to Islam. All of this diversity you find in the companions of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, with a single objective and a single message, and that is to stand for the truth. So you see this beautiful unity in diversity. I'd like to end tonight by remembering two scenes from Karbala. The first is the example of Joan, this elderly man who, the tradition, it tells us that Joan was an ex-slave. He was a freed slave. He was the slave of Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, the great companion. And tradition says that after Abu Dharr had been exiled from Medina during the time of Uthman, by Uthman ibn Affan, after he expelled Abu Dhar al-Ghifari from Medina, Jawn, he went under the care of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And he stayed with him, and he remained loyal to him. The tradition says that after Amir al-Mu'mineen, he went under the care of Al-Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. And after Al-Imam al-Hasan, he went under the care of Al-Imam al-Hussein. And he remained a loyal follower of these Imams. How beautiful of an honor Jawn had to be at the service of these great Imams and to live with them and to see them every day. Jawn, we said, was an elderly man. He used to be a slave. He was from Abyssinia, from Africa, and he had no family. He had no ancestry, no name recognition. But he had loyalty. He had devotion to the truth. He had devotion to the Ahlul Bayt. He approaches Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He tells him, "Oh my master, I seek permission from you to go out onto the battlefield. My master, give me permission to go out and to fight for your sake and for the sake of the truth." Imam Hussein, he looks at him. He tells him, "Oh Jawn, you don't need to go out and fight. You are an old man. You have been with us for a long time. You are excused from going out into battle and from participating in battle. Go back." Jawn, he begins to weep. He cries. He turns to Imam Hussein. He tells him, "My master, how can you tell me this? I stayed with you for all of these years in comfort and goodness. I stayed with you and you took care of me, but now in the time of hardship and difficulty, you expect me to leave you and to abandon you. By Allah, I will not abandon you. I will not leave until I stand up for what is right, and until I am killed for your cause, and until my blood mixes with your blood." Allahu Akbar. Jawn goes out. Imam Hussein gives him permission. He goes out to fight, and despite his old age, he fights valiantly and courageously until he is struck and he falls. The tradition, they say that Imam Hussein, he went rushing out to Jawn. He took him close and he placed his cheek on the cheek of Jawn. This is one scene. Another scene we have is of the young man. Some traditions say he was 25 years old. A man by the name of Wahab ibn Habab al-Kalbi. The traditions, they tell us that he was a young man, that he was a newlywed. It had only been a couple of weeks that he had gotten married, and that he had come to Karbala with Imam Hussein along with his mother and his wife, and that they had converted from Christianity to Islam, and they had joined the camp of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. This young man, he is with his mother. The story of how they accompanied the Imam is very beautiful. It's a long story. I don't want to mention it now. Very beautiful story. But his mother, she tells him, "My dear son, Wahab, I want you to do everything in your capacity to stand with Imam Hussein. Do not abandon him. Do not leave him at all." Wahab is getting ready to go out onto the battlefield. His wife, they had recently been married. His wife tells him, "Oh Wahab, please do not go out. Do not abandon me. We have just recently gotten married. Do not leave me." The mother, Wahab's mother, she tells him, "My dear son, do not listen. This is Aba Abdullah al-Hussein. Go out and sacrifice yourself for his cause." Wahab, he goes out, we are told, he begins to fight valiantly, courageously on the battlefield until his hands are injured. He comes back to his mother. He tells her, "Oh, my mother." She looks at him. She sees him injured and bleeding. He says, "Oh, my mother, are you pleased with me?" His mother tells him, "No, O Wahab, I will not be pleased with you until I see you have lost your life." Goes out and he begins to fight the enemies until suddenly he notices that as he is fighting the enemies, they surround him and they strike him. At this moment, he notices that his wife comes running towards him from the camp. She is running towards him. She comes to him, calling out to him, telling him, "Oh Wahab, I want you to fight as much as you can. Do not have any shortcomings." He turns to her. He tells her, "What is it that changed your mind? Only a few moments ago, you were discouraging me from going out. Now you are encouraging me to go out to fight. What happened?" She tells him, "Oh Wahab, do not blame me for the sound of the cries of Imam Hussein calling for help and assistance. The sound of the women and the children crying, it broke my heart, and therefore I ask you to do everything in your capacity to fight." We are told that Wahab, after he was struck on the battlefield, suddenly one of the enemies, he saw that his wife, she was there. He went and he approached her and he struck her on her head, causing her to fall and to be martyred besides her husband. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. وإلى أرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات نهدي جميعا ثواب سورة الفاتحة.